All right, today is Sunday, November 15th, 2015, and this is episode 139 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Hey, Jerry. How are you, sir?
I'm pretty good. I'm extremely happy that we now have a bingo game based on...
That is epic.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
I mean... You know, you've arrived when someone builds a buzzword bingo game around your podcast.
It's true, though I could completely screw it up but just by reading all the buzzwords right now.
Yeah, that's true. I assume that was just a representative of one
Right.
particular card. I'm assuming there's many, many more. So,
in theory, you would want randomization, right?
right, absolutely.
But I got to say, Phil Campbell put this together for us. We retweeted it, and that's awesome. And to think somebody took the time to do that is pretty stunning and much appreciated. And our silly little show is inspiring stuff like this is kind of humbling.
Indeed. So before we get started, we just want to remind everybody that the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and do not represent those of our employer or bingo cards.
That's true.
So,
or any possible sponsor, because we pissed them all off.
That's very true. All right. So
we're failing that whole monetization plan.
Yeah.
That's step 3 of profit.
The venture capitalists are steering very clear of us.
But hey, we even though it's internet points, and even though it's unfathomable and I cannot figure it out, we did peak at number 5 in the overall list of technology podcasts on iTunes.
I know. That was crazy.
Which is pretty wild. Of course, we immediately then dropped to 23. And then the other day we're at 52. So I have no idea how that works or why that works, but it was pretty wild.
There's some podcast barons that are holed up in a smoky, smoke-filled room at Apple headquarters, and they just monkey with ratings all day long.
Apparently.
So,
though, that does make us, for a very brief period of time, the number 1 rated information security podcast on iTunes.
That's right.
For at least 8 or 10 minutes.
Yeah, and then maybe it was 15 minutes.
And then they fixed the glitch.
That's right.
It kicked us back down where we belong.
All right, so we should probably, do some stories.
It's true.
So, we've got kind of three for this week, and first one is from Bloomberg. So, and we talked a little bit about this last time, but you'll think back to, I think it was last year, when J.P. Morgan was the victim of a major breach, and at the time, again, it was pretty well thought to be the work of Russian affiliated or Russian government affiliated hackers. And nobody really could explain why Russia would want 86 million mortgage holders contact information. But aside from that aside.
But clearly it had to be nation state.
But it was, yes. Well, I mean, the sophistication was such that it had to be nation state, right?
What else could it have possibly been?
Really nothing. Yeah. So there's a series of stories this week that really kind of shatter the story here wide open. And so the first one comes from Bloomberg. And the title is J.P. Morgan's 2014 hack tied to largest cyber breach ever. And this is kind of a great overview of the whole program here. Effectively, there were 3 main, quote, ringleaders who were operating a gigantic fraudulent, pump and dump stock fraud / fraudulent credit card processing / illegal Bitcoin exchange, and it was quite a sophisticated operation. And basically these criminals or alleged criminals were buying small penny stocks, and then they would pump and dump. But apparently that wasn't enough, right? So what they decided they needed to do was to target their messages more, right? So in order to do that, they figured, well, we really should focus on active investors. Well, where do we find active investors? Well, we find them in the databases of E-Trade and JP Morgan and Dow Jones and Scottrade.
Look, I don't understand why you're so upset. They were just doing really effective targeting marketing.
I mean, yeah, it was like it's practically a focus study, right? A focus group.
They knew their market.
Yeah. So they hired, apparently, and this kind of dovetails into the second story, which comes from Trust.org, which is the Thomson Reuters Foundation website, which basically says that these three people that we just mentioned were not actually the hackers themselves. They kind of oversaw the enterprise, as it were, which apparently consisted of hundreds of people. A network of 75 global companies that they had set up in order to move money around. And they had outsourced the hacking of all of these financial institutions to get contact information, and then in turn spam those people with leads on penny stocks.
So the theory is they buy a crap load of penny stocks, which is really low cost stocks that are not traded on the major exchanges. Then they get all this contact information, send out basically whatever to induce and entice other people to buy the stock, therefore boosting the stock price, and then they sell.
That's right.
Which is all sorts of illegal in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
and it gets worse too, because they had kind of a full cycle ecosystem here. They were not only doing the pump and dump, they were also actually working with I don't know what you would call them, right? But advisors to some of these penny stock companies, encouraging them to either go public or to merge with other existing public companies, in the context of their stock scams. I mean, this was a gigantic business.
So again, now they're just being activist investors, which is what a lot of people do.
Yeah, I mean, like Carl Icahn, right?
Right.
There you go.
Look, again, this is capitalism, buddy.
So, it was. It's really fascinating. The thing that struck me is as I was reading these really three stories. The third one comes from Krebs on security, and he's talking about something I'll get into in a second. But it really strikes me as disturbing / interesting that you've got this really sophisticated network of a criminal organization that is completely in the private sector, right? And things that I think maybe a year ago would have only been thought possible in the context of some super sophisticated nation-state attack is in fact attached to really not much more than a financial fraud operation, a big one.
Sure.
But
so, we kind of glossed over it. I want to circle back on the outsourcing aspect because I think that's pretty interesting and very, very worth discussing. So they, according to the story, reached out and basically hired out these hacks. In other words, they sort of solicited people, said, hey, we want the customer contact list from major financial companies. And various black hat hackers basically said, sure, we'll take the gig.
Right.
And delivered on that. And as far as we know, the people arrested haven't given up those names yet.
Yeah, and in the indictment, which is actually linked off of the Krebs on Security article, they call it criminal conspirator number one. So pretty interesting. So going back to the Krebs on Security article for a second, one of the apparently fairly significant aspects of their business, which apparently they used to help launder the money they were making, was basically a credit card processing organization, and this was intended to accept transactions from online pharmaceutical sales and the bogus antivirus, scareware antivirus, and it's interesting that the banking industries, as you might expect, has gotten pretty robust, and in fact they hire out organizations to help pinpoint this kind of fraud, right? And so that they want to make sure banks aren't accepting transactions from these kinds of fraudulent organizations. And so companies like G2 Web Services are actually contracted by organizations to basically buy stuff through spam that's advertised through spam and other means, and then they kind of trace back where the transaction is being processed, ultimately back to the originating bank, and then the card brands go and they punish those card brands or the issuing banks for accepting the transactions. Well,
so what I'm learning here is that at a minimum, if I start spamming out crap stuff for sale, at least these fraud intelligence firms will buy it from me.
At least, that's right. If no one else will. So
good to know. I'll make a note.
There you go. So knowing that this was going on, these three criminals ordered up a hack of G2, and so they were, for a period of time, not really sure exactly how long this was going on for, but they were actually monitoring the comings and goings of G2. So they were basically trying to figure out, and apparently they did, what card numbers that G2 was using in order to try to buy these, the things that advertised through spam and whatnot, so that they could actually reject the transactions. The idea being, if these organizations that are looking for the fraud can't see that the fraud is happening, that it's being, it's kind of being obscured. And on the other end, they talk about how this, these organizations, the fraudulent organizations, are just completely lying through their teeth about the business that they're in. They're reporting the transactions as being pet supplies and things like that, completely unrelated to what they actually are. And act surprised if they get called out. Now, another thing that really surprised me, and this is very, very surprising, is that, again, these banks would periodically be fined by the card brands. And when that happened, apparently this criminal organization would actually repay the banks the amount that they were fined, so that they would continue doing business with them. Really, really interesting, very interesting stuff.
Which would tell you that they're making far more money than the fines, which makes for an ineffective fine.
Yeah, and I think some of the fines were in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it sounds like these guys were making hundreds of millions of dollars.
So the other thing I've learned here is that I should start reacting to those pump and dump stock schemes, because clearly they're working. So if somebody else is pumping them, I should jump on that bandwagon.
You just got to get out before they get out. That's all.
Right.
Yeah.
I got to rethink all my investment strategy. I've been going about this all wrong.
Yeah, I as defenders, I think that the thing that is really important to take away from this is, number one, there's a lot of money in this stuff. There's a lot of creative people who are determined to use their creativity to make money illegally. And this is a great example, I think, of how that can play out, right? And so, here's a case where they got caught. How many more of these kinds of things are are going on. We don't necessarily know. I think these guys were actually pretty careless when you look at their OPSEC. I mean, they were bragging on forums about all the stuff that they were doing. I can imagine if they didn't brag, probably would have might not be talking about them here. So
yeah, it's possible. It's pretty amazing. The other thing I would say is that if you're in any sort of anti-fraud business, what was G2 Web Services? What was their security like? Did they have the concept that they might be targeted? They think they were just off the radar.
Yeah. Apparently, there was an interview. According to Krebs, there was an interview they did a couple of months back separately about applying artificial intelligence to detecting fraudulent transactions. And apparently they made a comment, the person they were interviewing made a comment about how they were themselves were the target of having to defend themselves against these attackers. So but takeaways, there's a lot of money in this stuff, right? It's not all nation state. A lot of these hacking techniques or resources are available for hire, right? You don't have to have someone who's a genius, to get into your network, because they can hire it out. This has become very commodity type stuff. So, really kind of beware. And I think the other thing too is understanding the utility behind your data, right? So I don't think looking back, a lot of these organizations probably didn't think about their data being stolen for this purpose.
Certainly, and that is a huge point that I wanted to make as well. Is sometimes the reason behind a breach or data being stolen is not immediately apparent, but it doesn't mean there isn't a good reason.
Yes, exactly.
And I remember when this originally happened, we were speculating that this was Russian intelligence and this was all sorts of stuff. And something far more mundane, but certainly far more profitable, turned out to be the case.
Yep.
And it comes back again and again to our lack of imagination. And the bad guys are incredibly imaginative. And clearly this is probably not the only instance of this going on. And the bad guys get smarter each time. Usually,
well,
the
I
good
think,
ones.
Yeah, I think they're learning from each other, and the other interesting thing too is those that criminal co-conspirator is not apparently identified. So it's not clear that law enforcement actually even knows who it is.
So, I will say I did notice Bob was driving a new Mercedes the other day.
Yeah, I thought he was just getting a new job, but maybe.
I did. I'm not saying. I'm just saying.
Interesting. I'll have to have a talk with Bob.
Be careful. He might have some very powerful Russian friends now.
That's a good point.
It is a wild story, and I'm sure the SEC is not happy, and. Yeah, this may have some more interesting implications for how much money they were making.
Yeah, one of the articles I saw said somewhere north of $350 million.
So, did we ever learn how the actual breaches occurred? Like where the failure was on JP Morgan and such for what allowed the data to be exfiltrated to begin with?
Yeah, we talked about that, I guess, a month or two, maybe 3 months ago. My recollection was it was somebody got phished.
Right. Which was the beginning stages.
Yeah.
But I don't recall if we ever got into what happened from then. Was it password reuse of an admin? Was it... And here's where I'm going with this. We know that a lot of things start with phishing, but that's usually only the first stage of... I'm not going to use the term you hate. The first stage of the attack. And the takeaway for me... Or the lesson learned here for me is how do we start monitoring for and trying to stop that linked event series, I won't use the term, before we get to the point of exfiltration or spotting it as the exfiltration happens. And this is something I think we suck at right now as a discipline.
I think generally we're unwilling, as an industry, I think we're unwilling to take the steps necessary to do that. Because it's resource intensive and it's painful and it's expensive and on and on. But ultimately, that's what this stuff is hard, right? There isn't a little blinky box that you can put in that's going to detect that. So.
Well, I think we need to make one. I see a business plan.
Or at least sell one that claims to do it. Right.
Data exfiltration detection system.
Yeah.
DEEDS.
There you go. I think that you are absolutely right. One of the problems is it's such a diverse, kind of possibility tree. Once you have that initial intrusion, the way in which people can go through an environment is just unfathomably large.
Absolutely.
And so you have to look for what are the common attributes that you can look for.
Yeah, agreed. And that, probably bears a whole show to discuss in and of itself. I guess my point that I'm kind of hinting at is we've got to move beyond just trying to stop phishing and, having that be the entire focus of our strategy and say, okay, once we have been phished, what are they going to do then? And start looking for those indications.
Yeah.
As best we can. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying we're still getting our ass kicked.
As is apparent by relatively low, I'm not going to say low skill, but, unsophisticated business models.
Yeah.
So, it's, that's a tough nut. I really do think that we've got to get better at the whole exfiltration detection. I mean, there's just no two ways about it. Until we have systems that that affirmatively are going to stop this kind of stuff, which I'm not sure reasonably can exist in a business environment, and maybe someday they can. I don't know.
When you say systems, you don't mean blinky boxes. You mean sets of controls.
Correct.
Ways of doing business. Okay.
Right. The environment is set up in such a way that avoids this or affirmatively prevents it from happening. We're going to be in the position of having to look for evidence and trying to stop it as fast as it can. Now, one of the things that is concerning to me somewhat is the concept of trying to detect the exfiltration as early as you can, because in all reality, it doesn't take that long to exfiltrate the data. And so, if you're only looking for, you might see the blip of a gigantic file being transferred out of your organization, and it's great that you can see it and you can go react, but it's gone at that point. So I think the more high value or higher order value is detecting the lower noise floor activities that happen leading up to that.
Yeah, certainly. And I, here's the frustrating part too. Let's say we get effective at spotting an 80 percentile common technique once a successful phishing attack has been established and they've got the beachhead. It is not that difficult for the attackers to shift techniques to a different technique. So then it comes back to, okay, what can we do with the data? And sort of start to really put a bastion around that data and really watch use of that data. And that's kind of where I start to think about it. If we know a certain target of data is being attacked, a certain class of data, perhaps there's different things we can do to monitor that data better. How often does the entire customer database need to be copied off? Maybe a lot in your environment. I don't know. Maybe not that much. I don't know. But that might be an interesting thing to watch for.
Yeah.
I think it comes down to knowing what is normal business behavior in your environment and trying to baseline that and then spot anomalies off that normal behavior, which is really easy to say and really hard to do.
Yeah, and probably also prone to a lot of false positives.
Absolutely. And this isn't something you could do with folks who have 10 minutes a day to tune a system. You've got to hire folks that all they do is care about this sort of problem and free them from the care and feeding of anything else and the other fire drills and this is a really labor intensive, really smart person process. It's not something you can just throw some technology at and call it a day.
So which kind of leads to a question, and this is a very uncomfortable question, I think, for us in this industry. Is it worth it?
I think that's a company by company decision.
Yeah, I suppose so.
If we take a step back and we look at, let's just pick JP Morgan for a moment, we'd have to ask them. Let's say they could, and of course we're always fighting the last war, the last breach, but let's say in this particular instance, just to play perfect knowledge, they had hired 3 people at fully loaded cost of $200,000 a year and gave them a budget of $500,000 a year. So now we're up to $1.1 million per year to watch for their customer database being stolen. Then we need to compare that to what is the cost to JP Morgan been for this breach in terms of goodwill, in terms of customers, in terms of legal expense, in terms of fraud investigation, in terms of remediation, in terms of all that stuff.
Right.
And that's only for one instance of an attack vector. And then take into account whether or not they have quote-unquote cyber insurance to pay them back for those costs.
Right.
And this is a very, very, very tough question.
Well, it is because, if you were going to be subject to, 10 successful attacks a year and each one of those attacks costs, $2 million or $3 million, it's an easy answer. But, that's knowledge that you don't have when you make that decision. So you've really got to think about, what kind of risk tolerance does your organization have, and are you, it's a tough nut because if you're spending money on this, you're not spending it somewhere else.
Yep.
And I'm not convinced that a lot of companies actually have the ability, to do that, and so they're just kind of, either knowingly or unknowingly accepting risk. And one of the things I think that drives a lot of people crazy is they're accepting risk of the loss of other people's data. So,
and that comes back to fundamentally long term what companies we choose to work with as consumers and customers and businesses and such.
Yes. Yep. So anyway, enough of that happy thought.
Yeah.
Let's move on to our next happy thought, which comes from the Consumerist. So apparently there's an airport in France called Orly, I believe it is. I get the sense this isn't a large airport. But apparently they were not able to land planes and allow planes to take off and land for a period of time because a piece of software that is relatively important, especially I guess when it's foggy or there's reduced visibility. There's a piece of software that I guess communicates visibility information to pilots.
I read this a little differently.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, so what they're talking about is RVR, runway range visibility, basically. Okay, and in essence, you have these light systems, if you will, that are set up down the runway, and it's measuring the opaqueness of the visibility so that you can give part of the weather to departing and arriving aircraft of, ceiling and visibility. So, and certain aircraft and certain types of landing classification have to have a minimum amount of forward visibility to land and depart, and certain aircraft and certain operations are equipped for, and certain airports are equipped for lower than more. So when you don't have good RVR, in essence, you have to assume the worst, that because you had fog in the area, it wasn't a clear day. They didn't have a reliable way of knowing that. And the way I read this from my research is that the system that went down was running those RVR systems and then giving that out to another system which communicated the full weather report.
Okay.
So it was just running the RVR sensors is the way I think this was, and it went down.
Yeah.
And Orly is actually a big airport. It used to be Paris's main airport. Orly and Charles de Gaulle are the two airports now in Paris. So it's one of the busiest for domestic traffic and second busiest French airport in terms of overall passenger. 27 million passengers in 2011.
Wow. Okay.
So it's a big airport.
That's a big airport.
Big commercial airport. Yeah.
I was envisioning something much smaller. Okay.
No. Yeah, it's a big one. It's kind of like Midway and O'Hare sort of setup.
Okay.
But not as equal, But O'Hare being Charles de Gaulle and Orly being Midway, but probably a little more diversified in terms of actual traffic.
Got it.
But anyway, so the key system can't measure the visibility on the runway, can't tell arriving and departing aircraft what that visibility is, so people can't make decisions on whether or not it's safe to land or take off.
Nice. So that system went down, and apparently there are 3 technicians in all of Paris who are qualified to work on that system, and apparently one of them is getting ready to retire. And well, I guess it must run really well. I mean, I can only assume that it's very stable and runs very well because it runs on Windows 3.1.
Now, is that like a new version of Windows 10?
Well, I mean, I was thinking like 31,
right?
Windows 31 must be really advanced. But no, actually, 3.1. The one that was that went out of support 20 years ago.
That is amazing. But I bet this is fairly common.
Yeah.
Maybe not entirely common, but this is one of those things that if it doesn't work, don't fix it. If it doesn't break, I should say. If it works, don't mess with it. And we hear this a lot, like Windows XP right now on medical devices and that sort of thing. But man, this is the risk of having really old systems.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about this in the past. When you and I think honestly, this is the conflict between commodity IT and industrial type systems, where industrial type systems are expected to be relatively long-term investments. They're intended to be stable and more or less, just kind of work. And I think that over time there's been a blending of the two, and it doesn't really work. 'Cause, so for those of us on the IT side and the security side, we kind of look at this and say, well, what a bunch of dopes. But I think from the other side, the expectation is that this is a system that you're not intending to replace every 5 years,
right?
And I fully expect that's kind of how they got here. I'm not defending it, however,
it's almost completely understandable. They're treating it like an embedded system. They're treating it like a purpose-built embedded system, which makes sense, but fundamentally, from an operational standpoint, you have to take into account the serviceability of a key system, whether it's embedded or not.
Right.
And if it's a critical system, you've got to have a backup plan.
Yeah. Well, I'm assuming they had a second 3.1. I don't know. It was. It is an interesting and odd story that this. And by the way, I think it's also notable to say that where everybody's pointing at this and laughing, but it's not actually clear that Windows 3.1 had anything to do with the problem, right? It's that it's a system that runs on Windows 3.1 that had a problem. So
correct. I think the bigger issue here is that the antiquated system also probably indicates really antiquated hardware, right, and really, really rare skill set.
I can only imagine that the reason it went down was because it was probably jam-packed full of dust. Can you imagine that? A Windows 3.1 system still running. You open that thing up, what are you going to see?
Hey, you don't know. They might have an annual dusting plan. Could be part of their process. But, this brings up a key point that's probably going to piss off some people. I think of this very similar to when somebody comes into an enterprise organization and says, I can build an open source based system to do XYZ. The problem with that is exactly this. If it's a rare or obscure or heavily customized open source system that only one or two or three people know how to run, and you're reliant upon it for your business, you're putting yourself at risk.
Yeah.
And you have to understand and accept that risk before you go down the easy button of Bob, not our Bob, but Bob the sysadmin just built something based on random. It doesn't mean there isn't a lot of open source stuff out there that's heavily known, right? Linux, heavily known, and it's open source. Got no problem with that. But I'm saying really obscure stuff or heavily customized stuff, you put yourself at risk of not being able to maintain it and fix it later.
Yeah. Well, and here we are.
And that is why companies buy enterprise class commercial software so that they always have a third party to go to. Whether it makes sense or not, that is a safety blanket for a lot of executives.
Yeah, but again, Microsoft, I mean, Windows 3.1 is from a pretty major company.
But it's been out of life and end of supported for a long time. So running end of life and out of support software is also a risk.
Yeah, I guess I can't help but think that if the context were different, and let's say this was a system running on a 30-year-old mainframe, we wouldn't be laughing. We wouldn't be pointing and laughing at it.
Perhaps, but it's kind of like Fortran, right? Things running on 30-year-old mainframes run Fortran, and the Fortran skill set was lost for a lot of people.
Or COBOL.
Or COBOL, sure.
Or MVS.
Yeah. And people had to go get trained up on that to run that gear. And you're right. There's a Windows 3.1 point and laugh aspect of this, but I'm trying to bring it up a level to say that you still have to think about the supportability of whatever it is you're running your business on.
Yes, I agree.
And that's where I think they made a mistake here.
Yeah. But I wonder how easy that mistake is to make, though.
Oh, I think it's easy. But our job is to try to make people smarter, right?
True.
So, and I'm not saying it's an easy. I would wager that this airport and operations folks have looked at swapping out the system many times.
Yeah.
It's not like they were oblivious to this risk. Most likely, it's not been addressed in the articles, but that's my gut. It's not like they're deaf, dumb, and blind to this issue. They know it. But it could be all sorts of reasons why. It could be funding, could be all sorts of things as to why this isn't being replaced.
Right.
Especially when you look at airports and public funding and that sort of thing. May not be something they could have replaced. But I'm saying if you do have control over these things, it's a reason why we say it's such a big deal to, especially now in an internet-connected world, not run out of support gear. From a vulnerability patch alone. 3.1, I'm not worried about anybody hacking into a 3.1 box. That's not the concern here. The concern is if your business relies on it and it goes down, what are you going to do?
Right. We don't even know this thing's connected to a network. So
I doubt it is. It's probably very local. It probably hands off maybe some data via serial to something else, just
right.
the RVR data. But and if you want to keep old crap up and running, great. But do a risk analysis of if this breaks, how long is it going to take to fix? Can I absorb that downtime? Do I need to have a backup hot standby ready to go in the meantime? And account for this problem that you may not be able to get parts, you may not be able to get people, you may not be able to get support from a vendor. That's the point I'm trying to make, which is we have gotten ourselves into a situation where the vendors can force us to keep upgrading because we are reliant upon their support.
Indeed. You're right.
So, anywho, I went off on a wee bit of a rant there, but...
So, yeah, Windows 3.1, control in the airport. There you go.
And by the way, if it hadn't been foggy, this would not have been a problem.
Right. Yep.
So...
All right, well, there it is. So our last story for this evening comes from securityaffairs.co, and the title is... FacBen is offering a professional ransomware as a service that relies on a new CryptoLocker ransomware, which can be downloaded through the executable file, which obviously not English as a first language here. But the thing that is very interesting to me here is that now anybody has the opportunity to be their own, cyber criminal for the low price of, I think, $50. So for a minimal investment, you can sign up to a service and customize your own version of CryptoLocker by setting the ransom and providing a Bitcoin address for the people who will pay you, and this organization will package it up. And apparently, there's also some added options related to different exploitation techniques. So those are more expensive upgrades, if you will, to the package. And then you can it's up to you to distribute it either through your favorite email client or the Magnitude exploit kit that you bought, whatever. Right now you are empowered to run your own ransomware campaign, and this service actually will collect the money, take 10%, and pass the rest onto your Bitcoin address, which is absolutely fantastic and scary as hell, right? Because this stuff is getting to be so commodity. I mean, we're not doing a very good job at defending against the ones that are, actually coming from people who are writing it themselves. And now here is an opportunity for any Tom, Dick, and Harry to, run their own attack. And holy cow.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And this is what we're getting to. Again, doesn't need to be state sponsored.
No.
Of course, this could be being run by a state, and we don't know that.
True.
This could be how North Korea is making money these days. You don't know.
I don't know. You're right.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this really points to a concerning trend that we really do need to do a better job about malware defense. And I know a lot of organizations are getting hit with CryptoLocker, and we talk a lot about this. And I know this is one of I think this is one of our bingo squares. So,
it may very well. Related CryptoLocker news. Apparently, a variant came out for Linux that was badly written and used the same encryption key, and so can be easily decrypted.
Well, actually, what it did was it seeded the random number generator that derived the key based on the system time. So all you had to do is go back and look at the modification time of the first file that was encrypted, and then you can actually generate the decryption key.
Well, there you go.
Which is awesome.
So even the bad guys make mistakes, is what we're saying.
Yeah, often.
Because by the way, good cryptography is hard.
That's right.
That's what we're trying to point out here.
Yes, that's right.
But yeah, and I think CryptoLocker is getting uglier and uglier, and clearly is. I'm waiting for the first CryptoLocker to hit a phone.
Yeah, well, there's been a fair number of lookalikes, I guess, that will attempt to appear to lock your phone, right? But right. I don't think it actually does.
Yeah, not to this level.
But they'll. Eventually it'll get there, I think.
Yeah, especially when you start hey, we're going to leak your most private sexting out to the world kind of threats.
Absolutely.
Oh.
Look out.
I'm going to delete all of our private chats, Jerry.
It's a good idea. Mm-hmm. Those will be uncomfortable. Anyway, that is our show for this week. Thank you again for listening, and thanks for everybody who has donated to our Patreon campaign. I can't say thank you enough. And if you like the show, give us a review on iTunes. That will help our internet points. That's always welcome. You can find links to all the stories we talked about on our show and all of our back episodes on our website at www.defensivesecurity.org. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at DefensiveSec. Follow Mr. Khaled on Twitter at Lurg and me on Twitter at MaliciousLink. And with that, we'll talk again next week.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great week, and hope to talk with you soon. Take care.
Bye. And they're not even nation states. Imagine that.
I am still a little skeptical that they're not nation state. I think they've been disavowed.
Oh, okay.
I think North Korea just said, "You're on your own, guys. You got caught." That's what I think.
Nice.
And
Yeah, could be.
their families are being held hostage by the North Koreans, so they're not going to roll on them.
They're just going to sit and rot in jail.
Absolutely, I think
They don't have a choice.
No. That's my theory.
Interesting.
I know. I'm just an asshole. You probably are going to have to fire me from the podcast over the controversy.
It was in your contract agreement, activities unbecoming a podcaster are strictly prohibited.
Well, yeah, but when you think about that,
Yeah, I know.
doesn't have a very strong definition behind it.
Well, but that's also the beauty in it.
So I need to lawyer up, is what you're telling me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye.